Hi, I'm Paul Marcel. In this episode of Angle Madness, we're going to build the drawer webbing for each of the drawer tiers. Now, the webbing itself is the part that the drawers run on. The runners are on the bottom, the kickers are on the top that keep the drawers from tipping. So, of course, along the way, we have to actually make the drawers. Now, the last episode I produced was one on doing compound angle dovetails. So you might recognize these sample boards that I put together in that video. So these have all been hand cut. They're not glued yet. They're just dry fitted. Mostly because I want to show how to do the glue up later. The glue up itself is a little bit different because, as you remember, when we glued up all these drawer tiers, there were a lot of some miter stitches, some miter stitch replacements, things like that, all to handle gluing on these goofy angles. Well, we have some goofy angles here. I can't put parallel clamps on both sides of that and just cinch it right up and expect it to work. So we have a couple considerations for doing the glue up that we're going to be doing in this episode to show that. Now, to make the drawers are pretty simple to make. They're only a little bit different just because of these angles, but not enormously different. So the way that I made these, if you remember from the compound angle video, I mentioned that you should bevel rip these boards. So this is the gauge, this is the inclination of the side of this drawer. Well, if we spin this around, you can see that I bevel ripped it. So the top of this drawer is flat, and so is the bottom. Now, I also did the same thing for the front, since that one is also inclined. It's inclined by this setting here, so I flip that up here. The top and the bottom, they run flat. So because of that, when I assembled the joints, they're all pretty much flat. I mean, until I glue these up, I'm not going to plane them to be perfect. Once I did one bevel rip, say for one side, how did I determine the width of this side? Because, of course, well, there's a certain height to this drawer opening. It's here. But then when you start tipping the board over, the board would have to be wider in order to fill that void up. So how do you get that measurement? Now, you could kind of just put a tape measure on here and measure up, but you don't need to use a tape measure. You can do it a much easier way. What I did is I took a bevel gauge, and I had this already set to the inclination of the side. I simply put this bevel gauge here, and then I took a look at it underneath the top of this drawer opening. So with that, I accounted for about 1/8 of an inch, so I just scooted the pencil mark down by 1/8 of an inch, and then I went down a little bit further just to allow for a little bit of clearance on the top here, and then I made a mark. Once I had that for this bevel gauge, all I had to do was take that board that I just ripped on one side for the bevel, I just tipped it up, and then I transferred where that mark was over to the board, and I ripped it at that point. So I have no idea what the width of it was, but that was the right width for this opening, and that's how all these drawers were cut. So then came hand cutting the dovetails and putting it all together. Now, this drawer, I built this drawer as a traditional drawer, which, I mean, the traditional drawer, it's kind of a standard anatomy for a drawer. I did not capture the bottom in here. The bottom actually has an escape out the back. So if you take a look at this, the pins and the tails are spread out over the entire width of this side up on the front of this drawer. But on the back, I started up a little bit higher, and that's where I did the layout. The reason for it is because down here, that's a little area for the bottom panel to sneak out. So here's the piece of ply that's in the bottom of our drawer. It sneaks out underneath it. Because when you're making a traditional drawer, normally you would insert the panel, a hardwood panel in here, so that it's going to expand and contract across its width. And it's going to expand and contract out underneath the bottom of the back of the drawer, so nothing gets blown out and you don't have any gaps on the inside. What you would typically do is maybe either put a small screw to hold the front, or sometimes you can just put a couple spots of hide glue up there just to keep the panel in place up in the front. So in this layout for the dovetails, you can see that I have 3 tails here, but they're different sized tails. In the back here, I have that somewhat mirrored. They're the same proportions. The other drawers also have the same thing. So the bottom tail is the largest, getting smaller to the smallest. It's the same proportions on the front and the back on all of them. They all have just 3 tails. What this models is the design of this whole cabinet. There's 3 tiers, and the tiers are actually, a larger tier at the bottom, a medium tier, and then a small tier. These are the same proportions as what would be used in the cabinet. So I wanted to just carry that element over. Now, whether anybody ever notices that, I don't know, but it was just something I wanted to choose in doing the layout. Now, another aspect of the drawers, when you're building a traditional drawer like this, is that the panel is going to have to scoot in right above this bottom pin. So here's the panel lines right here that mark where it comes out, and then of course here it comes out underneath where that panel is in the back. Now the reason why you do this is because you want to make it that when you cut the grooves in the side of this, you can just run it on the table saw. You want this pin to be unharmed when you're actually running the groove on this front pin board. So what that means is that this drawer on the front here, you can see the groove for the panel popping out. It's actually inside one of these tails. Now we don't care about this because we have a drawer front that's going to be applied to the front. So this is going to be glued onto the front and completely cover that up. So you'd never see that coming out the front. So now when I made the grooves for the panels, the only thing different with that versus regular drawers is that, well, we got these angles involved. So because of this bevel angle on the side, I had to bevel the blade of the table saw in order to make the groove. I only did it on the sides at first because it was easier for me to deal with just one setting and I could have it on both sides of the box. After I cut the groove, I reassembled the box and then I used a pencil to just transfer it over to the front and to the back where it was located and simply cut to those marks. Now how to effectively size the groove, you know that I normally use a KM1 when doing that. Well, one of the considerations for this is that the blade is being beveled over in order to make this groove. So as you take a blade and you bevel it over, the kerf actually becomes a little bit larger. So I did have to make a different setup block, just the same way that I did it for all the other blades that I have. But I used this one in order to set it up, in order to make the groove the correct size. Now this groove, the way I cut it is I just used a flat top blade. So normally I use an ATB blade in my table saw, but I switched over to this Forest #1 grind Woodworker 2 blade. It has a flat top. So you could think of it as an 1/8 inch wide dado stack. So with this I could take 2 passes to make the full size for the ply. Now there's a number of ways to do this, but one of the problems is because I ran it once and then I would run it again at the same blade height, you'd end up having basically a groove like this in the bottom. So it's got this little tiny ridge in the way where between the 2 kerfs. Now to flatten that out, all I did is I put a little 1/8 inch blade in my router plane and then I just set it to the correct depth and gave it a pull, and it just pulled that little tiny ridge right off. So it made for a nice flat bottom that was just perfect for doing the assembly. What's nice is that this makes it that the panel, when I cut the panels were also bevel cutted on the edge so that they could fit in this angled slot, the angled groove where the wall was angled. What I like about that is it made it that it maximized the amount of material that we left on the drawer side. So we got it all to fit in there nicely. There's plenty of support there for the ply, but also we took a minimal amount of material out of here. So at this point, we need to get these things glued up. So let's go do that. So this is the 3rd drawer. The other 2 are already done, and before I take it out of the clamps, I wanted to show a little of what I had to do to get this glue up to go well. Now, I already removed one of the parallel clamps. Now, one of the things I had to do to let the clamps get some good purchase on the edges is I took a 2x4 and I ripped it at the bevel angle for the sides, and then I simply used some double stick tape to stick some cork on it. Now this is some cork I used in a refacing of my stairs in the house, so I kept all the offcuts knowing that this stuff here is really useful in the shop, and it certainly is in this case. So what the cork provides is a little bit of a buffer for the fact that the pieces that I'm gluing on here, there's going to be protrusions and such. I want this to wrap around and be able to apply a good even pressure. So these worked really great at giving myself some flat edges for pulling that in. Now you might be wondering, what's the weight doing here in the middle? Well, even though I've got some flat edges on here to squeeze, ultimately the edges are still at an angle. So it still has this desire to sort of get squirted out the top, a bit like a watermelon seed. So when you put the clamps on it and you're tightening it up, it'll pretty much stay down until you start to get near the end, and then it'll start to inch its way up a little bit. So you'll find that there's some uneven gaps on the bottom. So if I simply used these, tightened up the clamps and walked away, I would be gluing it with a twist in the drawer. So all I needed to do is just put this board across here with a weight, and that was more than enough to keep it flat down on the bench while the clamps were clamping up the dovetails. Now one thing that was also nice about using the veneer tape on the ends is like this one here. It looks kind of trash, but all the squeeze out came out onto the paper. So actually this little tail presser board, whatever we want to call it, that was on there got glued. It would have been actually taking out chunks of my drawer had I not put some of the veneer tape there. So that actually turned out to be kind of a nice benefit having done that. So at this point, all I have to do is run through all 3 drawers just to trim the pins flush to the sides and trim the tails flush to the sides, and then we're ready to go for using this to put the webbing in. Now there are a lot of different ways you can do it, but I'm going to use the MFK 700. I already got this thing all set up. This is what I used to flush the outside edges of the boxes when I glued the panels down. So it's all set up really nicely. I'll be able to just run over these. It's got a down spiral bit on it, so you'll be using the drawer as a backer for the cuts themselves. So I took some sticks and made some runners for the drawers. Now what the runners are is just going to be a guide for the drawer that's going to be on the bottom. So the drawer is going to run on this 1/8" thick section that we have here, and then the outside edge is going to be guided by this inclined edge. Now I created those by simply making 2 cuts on the table saw, one this way here and then one this way here. It made it a lot easier to be able to remove this section. Now this section we're actually going to be using in a future episode, so keep it. So you can see them on the side of this drawer here. They're just going to be there to guide the drawer into place. Now if you take a look at this runner up in the front, you'll see that even though I've got this pressed against the drawer, there's a small gap here in the front. Now the gap is intentional. What I did is I placed the drawer in the middle of the opening, and then I marked the end grain of what we are able to see. And then I took a hand plane and I trimmed the last inch or so of that runner on the side until I met up with that line. So what this does is it makes it from the front, you're not going to be able to see that end grain. It makes it look a little bit nicer. But its primary function actually is that the front's got a little bit more room. So when you go to insert the drawer, it's a little bit easier. You can put it in there, and as soon as you push it in about 1 inch in, it'll snug it right up to the side of the runners. Now whenever I mention the runners, I also mention kickers. The kickers would be located up here to prevent this drawer from tipping down. Without it, it would keep tipping and fall off the assembly table. But by having those here, I can guide the drawer and keep it level on the way out. The kickers will be attached to the top panel once we put that in, so we have a little bit of work to do before we get there. So once we have the drawer placed properly, we can apply the drawer front so we can make sure we have a consistent reveal all around the outside edges. Now originally when I cut this drawer front, this whole piece here had just a square rabbet put into the bottom, but I didn't really want that. It doesn't really feel all that great, and there wasn't enough clearance. So what I did is I took my favorite bit actually. It's a linen fold bit. It's got a lot of nice curves to it. And I wanted to use this curve for creating the finger hold. So you can see that I've got the finger hold on here. Now, when I first took a look at this bit, of course I'm holding the board up vertically and I put the bit here, I really didn't like that profile. The reason why is when I finally got this bottom part as thin as I really wanted it, the problem was this top curve here became too thin. And if you think about it, this is where all the strength is. Because when I pull that front, it's this little thin area here that would have been holding the drawer. So I wanted to make that a little bit thicker. Now the way that I did that is I tipped the drawer back. So if you take a look at it, this is the profile I ran. So to hold the drawer front back like that while I was running it against the router bit, I created a small one-off jig here. So what this will do is I simply clamp the drawer front onto these inclined pieces of 2x4, and then I can just run it as a whole carriage up against the router table fence. So that's how I accomplished getting this little profile. So if a profile isn't perfect the way it is and you need it a little bit angled, it's really easy to make basically a small carrier like this in order to run it up against the fence and make a safe cut. So once we have the drawer front glued to the front, then we're going to want to establish the drawer stops. Now the stops are going to be used to stop the drawer as you push it in so that you can get the front to be nice and flush. Where I'm going to put those is behind the drawer here. There's a little bit of clearance here in the back, so I'll place this drawer so that the front is as flush as I can get it with everything the way it is. And then back here I'll rip some stock to be the correct thickness, plane it down or whatever until I get it just perfect so I can glue it in the back, and it's going to act as a stop right behind this portion of the back of the drawer. So this whole side, the whole corner on both sides will act as a stop. So it'll make it nice, it'll square up nicely to the front. Now, once we get to that point where we have the stops in the back, that's when we can finally do some shaping of the front of this drawer. So at that time, we'll take a clamp and we'll clamp the back of the drawer to the stop on both sides. That's going to hold the drawer front exactly where it would be when the drawer is closed. And then we can take a sander and we can sand this whole front as a single unit so that we can get the drawer front and the sides flush to each other. So it goes straight across. There's no little gaps or bumps or anything like that. So it'll make for a perfectly fitted front. Now there is one other thing I'd like to do with this whole sort of drawer webbing, and this will happen later, but we'll talk about it now. And that is this runner here was ripped at an angle. So of course I did an angled cut down here, an angled bevel cut, so that this rides against the side of the drawer nicely as opposed to leaving a groove. But I also did the outside as a beveled rip. When I do the kickers, I'm also going to do a beveled rip there. Now the reason is I can make it that the kicker up here and this piece, the side, is going to be planar to each other. When that's the case, I can rip some boards. They won't be this thick, but this is a sample that I have with the correct angles on it. And I'll be able to insert it and glue it to the outside edge of the runner, and then it'll glue to the outside edge of the kicker. Now, what that's going to do is it's going to significantly strengthen this box and actually help take a load off of this bottom panel. If you think about it, the top panel is a panel sitting inside of a rabbet. I can press on the panel, it'll flex a little bit, but it would take a lot of work to press down enough to make the panel actually blow through. It won't do that. The bottom one, however, is there's a rabbeted opening and the panel was inserted up and glued in place. Now you have the weight of a drawer sitting on that panel, basically trying to push it out. So it's not something you want to leave in your design without adding some strengthening. The guides and the kickers, both, when they're glued to their respective panels, are going to reinforce the panel to thicken it so that it won't bend as easily. Once I put this board in here, they practically will not bend at all. Plus, the bottom panel, this runner, being attached to the panel, and being attached to the top panel that's in this rabbet, it's all going to work together as a unit to basically almost suspend the drawer up here and really take a lot of the load completely off the bottom. So the whole thing is just going to make it a lot stronger. Now, a note about gluing that wood in: when I do that glue up, I'll be doing it actually with hide glue. The reason for using the hide glue is because there's going to be mechanics in the corner for interconnecting all these different layers. Now, if I needed to go in there and retighten something up or whatever, take it apart because I'm moving, it would be nice to be able to take that panel out and get easy access. So if I do it with hide glue, it's very easy to just warm up the joint on both sides and pull the board straight out. And this is also actually the reason why I will attach this drawer front with hide glue here in the front, because it's something that if later something happens to the drawer, gets damaged, it gets broken, whatever, the drawer front is actually all I really care about, because that's what matches the rest of the furniture. The box could get swapped out, nobody would know the difference. So by using the hide glue, I could very easily put this on a bandsaw, just resaw straight down this side here so I have very little of the drawer still attached to the front, warm it up with a heat gun, scrape that right off, and then I can make a new drawer box. It makes something that was unrepairable now very easily repaired, if a little bit of a nuisance.